In 2018, huge protests were erupting in France, led by the Gilets jaunes, or Yellow Vest movement. They were speaking out against a hike in the fuel tax, which, combined with rising unemployment, had left many hard-stretched families out of pocket. At the same time, 1,000 miles away, this was happening.
We need to keep the fossil fuels in the ground, and we need to focus on equity.
Those words, equity and green, were the buzzwords of the annual UN Climate Change Summit. It spelled out the next big challenge for policymakers and business leaders: how to make the transition to a greener economy fast and fair. That same year, across Europe, new anti-establishment governments came to the fore, promising radical measures to empower voters who felt left behind. And then, the pandemic hit. COVID-19 highlighted and worsened the world's inequalities and prompted a renewed urgency to tackle the climate and economic crises together.
Build back better
Became a global slogan. Now, as governments around the world inject billions of dollars into the economy to kickstart a greener recovery, it's clear that workers and communities can't be left behind. That's where these two words come in. To achieve a just transition, there must be measures in place. Otherwise, attempts to sustainably transform our economies might fail and put even our democracies at risk. From oil rig workers in Scotland to coal miners in India, workforces will have to be equipped with new skills or compensated if they can't adapt. In countries undergoing structural economic change, experts say a just transition model can create a viable path for society while preventing populist leaders from exploiting people's fears. But beyond the need to protect people's rights, homes, and land, there are opportunities. It's been projected that if governments focus on restoring nature in their COVID-19 recovery packages, it could help create almost 400 million jobs and $10 trillion in new business opportunities by 2030. A big challenge lies ahead. So, how much progress have we made so far? And as we make this transition, how do we protect jobs and our democratic values while making sure that nobody is left behind?
Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to our panel discussion on the just transition. I think our video has set the scene nicely, coming out of Jeff Sachs's intervention, making the case that even in rich countries like the United States, it's far from evident that we are going to be able to achieve anything like a just transition due to the fact that a lot of the social support is lacking. And perhaps it's even more the case in some developing countries that just don't have the fiscal space or the resources at this point in order to be able to help people with the transition to a greener economy. My name is Megan Rowling. I am a climate correspondent with the Thomson Reuters Foundation. And we are boosting our work on just transition, focusing, well, everywhere around the world, but from the United States to India, Bangladesh, and Brazil. And I'm just back from the Glasgow climate change talks. And at COP26, I feel as if just transition was really pushed up the agenda globally, especially as it relates to developing countries, because it was clear at the climate talks that there's been a realization among donor governments that we won't keep global warming below 1.5 degrees Celsius or get to net zero emissions by mid-century unless there is more help put in place for poorer countries so that they can avoid building more fossil fuel infrastructure and adopt clean energy. So I do feel as if just transition was on a lot of people's lips at Glasgow, and there were some concrete things announced too. So before we go to the panel, I'll just run through a couple of those. For example, the Climate Investment Funds launched a $2.5 billion funding program to help South Africa, India, Indonesia, and the Philippines wean themselves off coal power and onto clean energy in a swift and socially fair way. And then South Africa is also going to get another big $8.5 billion tranche of support that was coming from a separate partnership backed by countries from Canada to Germany that's going to help South Africa get itself off coal and drastically reduce its emissions by 2030, and at the same time pursue a just transition that supports workers and vulnerable communities, especially coal miners, women and youth. And then we also saw 13 countries, mainly in Europe and North America, plus the EU, sign a statement that supports a just transition internationally. Another promising development. And then I guess to cap everything off, we did have a little bit of drama at the end of the COP26, where in the final session of the conference, India, backed by some other coal dependent developing countries, I think China, South Africa, Nigeria, basically pushed to have the wording on a phase out of coal power sort of weakened or softened to a phase down of coal power. And India's argument there was that developing countries should be allowed to use their fair share of the global carbon budget, or whatever's left of it, which is not a great deal, in order to enable them to develop after industrialized countries used fossil fuels in a profligate manner to fund their development. So that was something that very clearly put just transition onto the agenda at the end of the conference, although just transition was already referenced in the Glasgow Climate Pact. But there was a push there by developing countries for that sort of on the global level to have a more just transition. So with that background and clearly rising interest in this issue and absolutely the importance of it, I will introduce our panel. So we have 4 speakers today. We have Sharan Burrow, who's the General Secretary of the International Trade Union Confederation, which represents 200 million members in more than 160 countries. I think Sharan is the first woman leader of the ITUC, and she's been at the forefront of calling for a just transition for many years at the UN climate talks, and was able to get that into the Paris Agreement in 2015, which was a promising start. Next, we have Michal Rutkowski, who is Global Director for Social Protection and Jobs at the World Bank. And Michal is responsible for protecting the poor and vulnerable from shocks through things like improving job opportunities, earning capacity, and social insurance and social safety nets. We have also Jill Tucker, who is head of the Labour Rights Programme at the Loudest Foundation, which was formerly known as the CNA Foundation. Jill has a lot of experience working in the apparel sector with companies like Reebok, Adidas, and on auditing and improving the human rights records of companies, especially in the garment sector in Asia. And then we also have with us fresh back in Delhi from Glasgow from COP26, Harjeet Singh. Harjeet has a lot of different sort of hats that he wears, but I think one of the most important ones for this discussion is he's strategic advisor on global partnerships with the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty Initiative. He also works with the Climate Action Network International, and for many years he was the global policy lead on climate for Action Aid. And Harjeet and I have worked together at many climate change conferences where Harjeet is always to be found advocating for climate justice and action on things like loss and damage, and pushing that to the forefront of the UN climate process. So welcome everybody. We're going to have a conversation about just transition and various aspects of just transition, starting with basically what it means to you and your organisations, and looking at some of the work that you're doing in this space. So we'll start with Sharan. Sharan, the ITUC has been pushing for a just transition at UN climate talks and in other forums for many years now on behalf of the unions and the workers they represent. And how has the Confederation's thinking on just transition evolved over that time?
So we've been very clear that we understand every sector has to transition. Energy is the foundation, of course, but every sector, heavy industry, transport, construction, pick a sector, agriculture, we need to make that transition. But you won't make it happen, given we're in a race against time to save both people and the planet, if you don't put people at the heart of the sustainability questions. So for us, it's always been about jobs, jobs and jobs, climate-friendly jobs, with just transition measures. And that means that workers and their communities need to know what the plan is. They need to have hope that there will be jobs for themselves and their children. They'll be able to put food on the table. And for unions, it means a seat at the table representing their workers in what the design of those measures are. Now, we saw a lot of countries step up to the mark this year on just transition. It's true. And I'll come back to the South African partnership because if we get it right, it's a good model. But we also saw a lot of companies signing up to net zero by X and Y, and we know we have to do more than half the job by 2030. But I now want to see not just national jobs plans, but those companies' jobs plans, where we're at the table negotiating what that means. Because in the heavy industry sectors, then there are jobs in many of them. In steel, there are more jobs with new technologies, but we need reskilling. In indeed coal, we have to exit from coal. But in renewable energy, the good news is that for every 20 jobs, there's up to 10 jobs in supply chains. And if they're good jobs, decent work, there's 30 to 35 in the broader communities. And that's how you build and reassure communities that there's a future. So if you take the South African model, then it's indeed a very serious model. I'm not going to pretend it's going to be easy, but indeed Eskom, which happens to be a state utilities company, with the money that's now in support of transition, 8.3 billion from those 4 countries and the EU, then indeed they've done a local impact study with the voices of community and workers. There's a strong collective bargaining council in the company. If we can now see them live up to the promise of transitioning production, distribution, and indeed the supply chain, we can start to assure people there are jobs in the future. So I have to say that while COP26 fell down on ambition and indeed finance and the global solidarity on a whole lot of fronts, with just transition and some of the models that could get us there, we saw some hope.
That's great to hear, Sharan. And I think, that's something that definitely the starting gun has been fired on this. And with some of these big partnerships now kind of starting to emerge with the climate investment funds as well, like you say, it's not going to be easy, but, and hopefully we can learn by doing. And also, I heard at COP that there is some interest among donor governments to expand the South African model to other countries as well. So perhaps countries like Indonesia and others. And so, like you say, that is going to be something of huge interest, I think, going forward. Michal, we're going to turn to you now. I mean, the World Bank is obviously an organisation that works with governments, but also communities and many other partners. So, I mean, what has the World Bank been doing to drive governments towards appreciating the need for a just transition? And what sort of obstacles are you seeing there? What are the difficulties and where are some of the kind of early wins at this point?
Thank you very much for the invitation. Well, I am pleased to say that virtually all departments and global practices of the World Bank Group are engaged in the just transition agenda. There are 3 hard questions around it, or hard dilemmas. First is just transition nowadays needs to be seen as a part of a broader green transition. Second, a big hard question, just transition for whom? And the third is, and maybe it's a part of the second, is just transition needs to go beyond fossil fuels and beyond closure of factories towards embracing also situation of people in the informal sector, disappearing islands, the land desertification, and they also need to transit. But getting to the core of the issue, probably the question that is the most important and that entails a lot of dilemmas and trade-offs is this for whom question. Just for workers in fossil fuel sectors who may lose their jobs? Just for families of those workers, just for women in those families, for children in those families, just for communities in environmentally degraded settings, just for the national economy beyond fossil fuel sectors. For instance, through a redistribution of energy subsidies towards groups that have not already benefited or that have disproportionately borne the costs of brown industrial production. Just in the big sense of climate justice, I just pose 5 questions, and those 5 questions we try to answer every day in a country-specific context, talking to all the stakeholders in the country. What guides us is essentially an approach that rests on three pillars, 3 aspects of that. First being the land use side, focused on remediation and repurposing of closed-mine sites. And then second is very much the governance and getting the necessary legal and regulatory institutions in place to support transition. And finally, and from the point of view of my work, the most important, the people and communities side, measuring the directly and especially the indirect costs for workers, communities, and others affected in coal regions. So we have this 3-pillar framework of just transition for all, which guides our work. It has been developed for last few years. And we really, where we are absolutely certain is the call for a broad approach. We think we always need to start early. We need to consult all the stakeholders, and we need to, from day one, to see the impact on women, on vulnerable, and on the whole communities, and see second-round effects. Actually, the problems of early transitions, including transition, for instance, in my own country, Poland, in the 90s, away from coal sector, was very often not seeing the big picture. So we are calling for a big picture, and we are calling for talking to all the stakeholders, because obviously each one has a different perspective on what is most important, and having them all together is key. Let me say also that something in closing, getting back to what I started, that nowadays we really, within my global practice, social protection and jobs, we are really confronting the agenda of just transition more broadly than the decarbonization angle to really encompass green transition. Because greening actually can and needs to occur across all economic sectors if we are to achieve more sustainable development. And let me finish by saying that our governing board has endorsed the bank's so-called GREET strategy, green, resilient, and inclusive development. And this is our guiding principle in the post-COVID recovery engagement. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that, Michal. Yes, a couple of things really important, I think, came out of what you said. This need to look at the big picture, and also to look beyond what we traditionally think of perhaps as sectors that need a just transition, such as coal mining, and look sort of to the broader economy, because if we change our sources of energy to renewables, and that is going to have reverberations across all kinds of different sectors, whether it's transport, manufacturing, and also, for example, the need to reduce emissions from the agriculture sector, which is also going to raise the need for a just transition there. And something else that you said, you know, this thing about moving away from fossil fuels and how you change the economic structure, and this removal of subsidies that was referenced in the Glasgow Climate Pact. In fact, to begin with, the language was just fossil fuel subsidies, the need to phase out fossil fuel subsidies, and then the language was added that it should be inefficient fossil fuel subsidies. Now, some people would argue that all fossil fuel subsidies are inefficient, but talking to the UK presidency about this, they said that they wanted that to be understood in a social justice perspective. So, for example, you know, sometimes removing all fossil fuel subsidies in a very abrupt way can actually cause social disruption. So, for example, you know, in some cases, it may be necessary to maintain subsidies for things like LPG that's used for cooking in poor communities where people would otherwise be using wood and cutting down forests and all this kind of thing. So just to wrap up there, in the sense that, like, this is a complex picture and we need to look at all different parts of it. So I'm going to bring Jill in now. Jill, so Loudest Foundation is putting its funding into efforts to secure a just transition for workers in the garment sector and beyond, in other sectors too, as we've just been discussing. And why is this topic so important to the Loudest Foundation? Where and how do you see the opportunities to invest philanthropic dollars to bring about the kind of system change that is going to be needed here?
Thanks, Megan. Well, Loudest Foundation, as you said, was only founded a couple of years ago and was founded specifically to address the convergence of these two big issues that are facing us, growing inequality and climate breakdown. And we've chosen to do this, to focus on this, because this is urgent. We don't have time. We need to act now because these issues share similar root causes. And as a philanthropy, we're able to take risks. So we do see a lot of opportunities, but mainly we're focusing on the importance of including in the conversation the people and the communities that will be most affected by climate change and inequality. And this, of course, is the essence of just transition, social dialogue. So we're trying to support the communities out there who are building economic and political support. So, for example, in the labor rights program of Laudes, we're supporting what we're calling demand-driven social protection. So these are efforts to get workers to advocate for the development and improvement of social protection programs as a right of employment, not as some sort of extra benefit. So in a country like Bangladesh, even 8 years after the Rana Plaza disaster, apparel workers still do not have any employment injury insurance. And part of this is because all of the discussions have been between the government and the ILO, and workers really haven't been a part of the process. So we're trying to ensure that workers are engaging in advocacy and really demanding their rights. And we support a lot of organizations doing collective action. And even though at this point, most of that collective action is focused on labor rights, they're building power and social infrastructure and demonstrating the skills and the advocacy strategies that can be used really for any kind of mobilization, including, climate-related advocacy as well. We have a finance and capital markets program, and they're funding a large number of grants that are looking at increasing climate finance, and they're funding research and advocacy on new economic thinking with such thinkers as Kate Rayworth and Maria Mazzucato. And then they're funding a lot of other organizations, such as there's an organization called Influence Map that evaluates the climate-related lobbying of major corporations, and then gives a grade to these corporations that contend that they have sustainability plans and targets, but at the same time, they're lobbying against positive climate policies. Right now, there isn't any company on their list that gets an A grade, but there are lots in the E- and F range. And then finally, we have a built environment program that addresses the fact that the built environment contributes almost 40% of global carbon emissions. And this is generally through using materials like steel and cement. So they're promoting the use of low carbon timber and bio-based materials in construction. And these are just some of the ways that we're trying to support a more just transition.
Thanks very much, Jill. That's super interesting to hear. I mean, I think there's a very good point that you're making about how if you're building up workers' ability to advocate around labour rights, those same skills can also be used and come in extremely handy during a just transition and working on climate change and the impact that is inevitably going to have on the workforce and on workers' rights. And then also this point about the work that you're doing with companies or on companies, in terms of kind of holding them to account on these promises that they're making. I think that was a topic that was really in play at COP because now we've seen, in the last couple of years, this huge rash of promises from the corporate sector around net zero and what they're going to be doing to cut their emissions. But at the same time, how are they going to do that? And we still don't have a lot of those details. So I think that this work on the corporate sector is going to be super important going forward because, if companies don't stick to their promises, then clearly we're going to be in trouble. And also, I think it's still fairly early days in terms of what companies are aiming to do or planning to do around just transition. Although I'm sure Sharan can talk to us a bit later about some companies that have kind of been at the forefront of this, but there's still everything to play for. And so for companies to kind of feel that there's some kind of accountability there that's going to hold their feet to the fire, maybe not such a great analogy, but is super important. So I'm going to bring Harjeet in now. Harjeet, so I mean, obviously ensuring a just transition means finding ways to bring fossil fuel workers along into a new economic model that's based on clean energy, phasing out coal, gas and oil, and the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty is absolutely aimed at stopping further use of fossil fuels. But what does the treaty what is it also doing? What's its thinking around how not to leave workers in those dirty sectors kind of behind in the process of phasing out fossil fuels?
So, Megan, I think for us in the treaty initiative, the biggest concern has been that fossil fuel not being mentioned in the Paris Agreement. And we all saw how in COP26, for the first time, fossil fuels have been mentioned, but of course, limited to coal and not mentioning oil and gas. And I think you need to understand the politics behind it. Particularly rich countries continue to depend on oil and gas, and they've moved on from coal. So the focus is much more on coal and not on oil and gas. Of course, the subsidies part do cover, but not explicitly. So for us in the treaty initiative, it is very important to target fossil fuels head on, and that's exactly what we have been doing. They should be front and center of the discussion. And so as you said, yes, in the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty Initiative, we are calling for ending fossil fuel expansion, equitable phase out, but most importantly, global solidarity and cooperation for just transition. And we all know, it's so important for social and economic justice. And because Paris Agreement largely talks about the what part of it, what needs to be done. We need to stay below 1.5, we need to be resilient, but it doesn't talk very little about how. And this is where this treaty initiative is calling for the treaty that can be complementary to Paris Agreement and takes us further. I mean, out in the public is just a 1 year old, but as an idea, it has been older than that. And in the phase one, what we are trying to do is to promote the idea of global cooperation and solidarity and just transition for workers and communities. So we are talking about it, and thanks to our friends in the labor sector, as Sharan talked about and has been advocating for a long time, we also have to talk about global cooperation and solidarity, because if there are no resources, that's not going to happen. Of course, there's a talk of trillions, but we know that it's not really coming through, and we still have to hold those governments and companies, as you said, Megan, to account. And this idea in the phase one, we have been promoting it, and we saw 20 cities and local governments have endorsed the treaty itself, which includes the pillar on just transition. 101 Nobel laureates have endorsed these 3 pillars, including Dalai Lama, and 1,000+ organizations and 150,000+ individuals have come forward to endorse the treaty. So which means there's a lot of momentum in understanding that while we need to talk about ending fossil fuel phase out and ending expansion phase out, and just transition is really important. In fact, we had a round of consultations, and it's very clear when you talk about fossil fuel phase out in the global south, the sequencing has to be, you first ensure that we will work with communities and workers in the global south on a just transition. That gives them much more assurance to plan their phase out and ending expansion than just putting pressure on ending expansion and phase out without giving them any support for just transition. So just transition that way is a central piece if we want global south, which needs resources and global solidarity to phase out. And in the phase two, we've already started working with allies and governments on the nuts and bolts. So, which would require, how to look at time frame and inclusive transition planning mechanisms and alternate livelihood opportunities, where we talk about economic diversification at the, industrial restructuring. And we have to also talk about resilience and financial resources. So we really are looking at, as I said, on nuts and bolts of just transition, working with allies, civil society, as well as government. So that's where we are now at this moment.
Absolutely, Harjeet. Well, that's really good to know. I think, we've had and heard quite a lot of talk about just transition, but now this thing about really getting to the nuts and bolts of how you do it is I feel like we're sort of entering into that era now, and this is where we're going to really start learning. I think the next part of our conversation, I want to talk about, why is it so important that we get this right? I think that, there's two key things that we've seen in the last few years. One is, where in cases where governments haven't got it right. So, for example, in the video, we saw what happened in France in 2018 when the fuel tax hike was introduced, and there was a huge social backlash against this because people do want, I think, in the vast majority of cases, to see a green transition, and they do want to tackle climate change, but at the same time, they will potentially push back if they feel that the burden is falling unfairly on ordinary people, folks who are just trying to, make ends meet, while, like as Jeff said, billionaires are sort of swanning around with very little taxation. So I think, that's one risk that governments really obviously need to think about, which is, what happens if they get it wrong? And that is a very good motivation incentive to actually get it right and do it in a fair way. And the other thing that's happened clearly is the COVID-19 pandemic. And I think what's happened that's, super important there is that the COVID-19, which was a huge shock to many economies, has really exposed more than we ever perhaps could have expected the inequalities in our economic system. So that I do feel that at the moment that we're heading into this huge challenge of doing a green transition, that there's nowhere to hide now. We can't pretend that we don't know that these inequalities exist, and we've seen what happens, when there's a huge shock to the system, and the people that lose out, the people, who have to go out every day and keep working, are the people who are earning less, and the richer people get to sit at home and work comfortably without exposing themselves to risk of COVID in the same way. So I think that we're sort of working within that context right now. So we'll go back to Sharan now. So I'm just interested to know what the ITUC is seeing in terms of what's actually being put into practice on the ground, in terms of your demand that there should be a new social contract for workers that incorporates better social protection and climate-friendly jobs. And what are you seeing that could happen, or if it comes too slowly, what will the consequences be? Where are we at the moment in terms of the balance between knowing what we need to do and knowing what will happen if we don't do it?
Well, the consequences are disastrous. I mean, we're talking about an existential crisis around humanity. So, none of us can walk away from that, as painful as it might be. And, for people like me who've walked the coal fields, who've talked to, coal-fired power station workers, fossil fuel workers, you name it, this is a very hard message. But they also know that what they want is not necessarily for their children to be coal miners. They want their children to have secure jobs. So we've seen transitions before. The question is, can we actually do this one with some justice, number one? Because if we don't, and there's no trust, then you won't do it in time. And previously, we've never been under the same kind of time pressure to actually adjust our economic systems. I must say, I was listening to Harjeet around the fossil fuel companies, and I just have to say I totally agree. I'm really angry with the fossil fuel companies. There's no answer for coal, and we have to look after those workers and communities. You need a clear exit date, you need clear plans. And we've seen some of those just transition measures put in place in Canada, in Spain, the South African model I talked about, the discussions in terms of many different, just transition or jobs, green jobs, community panels that exist with workers and governments and employers. But the fossil fuel companies have it all. They have the capex, they have the assets, they have the infrastructure, and they have the technological know-how with a skilled workforce. If they were to transition much more rapidly, then they could actually make a huge difference in terms of stabilising communities. And I'm still struck by a conversation I had actually at the People's Summit. I spent most of my time inside that centre, but indeed I also was privileged to be able to co-open the People's Summit. And an Indigenous worker from not indeed Africa or Latin America or, you know, Canada or other places, indeed from the US, outside of New Orleans, worked on the rigs, actually has just become, with his family, part of the climate refugee community because of the disastrous storms through that part of the world. But his cry was, our people were forced onto fossil fuel companies when our lands were no longer our own. And indeed, you know, that's our only livelihood now. So how do we transition them? That's the conversation the company should be having with these workers. Yes, unions will be there to help, but it has to be by agreement with workers, their unions, and their communities. And it's not happening. And that's what's really makes me very, very angry with them. There are good, thoughtful people in companies like BP and Equinor, but they need to move faster. And the second thing that I would say is the fossil fuel subsidy piece was indeed a level of unacceptable compromise. Because if you were serious about this, there's like $1.4 trillion in these, in harmful environmental subsidies. It's a little broader than just fossil fuels, but the bulk is there. If you actually had seen them, say, repurposing those subsidies rather than eliminating inefficient subsidies, then you would capture the social justice issues in terms of redistribution, dealing with energy poverty, but you would also, you know, have the conversation, the dialogue about what that means. So fossil fuel companies, from my perspective, as someone who's for 25 years stood with business and asked for subsidies into innovation, into jobs, etc., then let's have another conversation. They can keep those subsidies if they're going in to indeed transferring to renewable energy, to keeping jobs in those companies, to building the skills that are necessary, to looking at community repair. All of those things are possible, but the language is wrong, and therefore the dialogue will be defensive about how do we keep them, how do we prove they're not inefficient, rather than being constructive about building the future.
Right, absolutely. I think there's, like you said, there's so much money washing around in the system. It's a case of like, how do you actually channel that into things that will help people deal with the changes that are going to come through in their lives. Jill, what's your view on this? I mean, clearly there are going to be costs of a green transition. How do you feel that this should be handled in a way that prevents social backlash?
Well, I think, as you've said, the transition's not going to happen if all the costs, or mostly all the costs, fall on the people who are most affected. I mean, not only is that not just, but it's just not going to happen because the funds aren't there. If you're a country that, you know, where 40 or 50% of your government revenues go to servicing debt, you're not going to be able to contribute much financially to the cost of a transition. So, you know, I think definitely COP26 did advance movement on some issues, but on the issue of who pays the bill for the cost of a green transition, I mean, that was not resolved. And I think the fact is, to achieve a just transition, we're going to need capital redistribution and a transfer of wealth from richer countries and communities to poor ones. I mean, it's really the only way to make this work. And as Dr. Sachs said earlier, I'm concerned that, you know, this is not going to happen because in my own country, in the United States, we can't even agree to tax billionaires. But I think there are some good things happening. I think we need real rules that hold business accountable for the environmental damage and human rights violations in their supply chains. If business has to internalize the cost of damage to labor and the environment, this could provide a strong incentive to change. The incentive being that if you are not accountable, you're going to be sanctioned. What I mean is, if in your supply chain you have partners that are responsible for environmental damage and labor exploitation, you as the buyer will be sanctioned. And this is hopefully the promise of mandatory human rights environmental due diligence laws. We're hoping that they're going to level the playing field on how business and government internalize the cost to the environment and to impacted communities. And I think there are other laws also. I mean, if there were laws that compelled business to link senior management pay to achieving their sustainability targets, I think we would see change pretty quickly. But if we don't redistribute resources and we don't pursue really aggressive new laws, there's going to be worsening environmental disasters and there's going to be more social unrest. So in reality, our best defense against that type of a future is to maintain functioning democracies, functioning legal systems, and really any movement towards a more fair and civil society can be considered meaningful climate action. And in that regard, if you're supporting union action, that is climate action. If you're securing living wages, that could be climate action too. If you're combating income inequality, that's a type of climate action.
Right, that's a super salient point, because at the end of the day, it is all about the resources that are needed. And Harjeet, I'll bring you in at this stage, because I know this is a subject that's very kind of dear to your heart, and that there's just increasing frustration among developing countries and vulnerable nations, the fact that the promised money that's required for transitioning to greener economies is just not coming through at the international level. So, what do we need to do at this point to avoid exacerbating the divide between the global north and the global south when it comes to green transition and a just transition?
Megan, the first thing is we need to recognize that we need a global plan. And this is where Treaty Initiative talks about a global plan, because if you do not have a plan which is based on cooperation, empathy, and solidarity, we will not be able to get there where we want to. And the question of just transition is not only for workers and communities in the global south, as we have been hearing, it's equally applicable for the global north. And I feel that, while climate conversations have been extremely contentious and toxic to a large extent, I think the concept of just transition can be very unifying, where when we talk about workers and communities who are going to be affected by the transformation that we are talking about, and where they show that solidarity, of course, workers and communities in the global north can rely much more on their own governments because they have resources. But for workers in the global south, they will need resources from the international system, and that's where the cooperation part comes in, and that's why we are talking about finance. And it becomes really important. Now, the moment we apply the lens of equity, everything becomes clear. So depending on our economic status, depending on our historical responsibility and the capability we have, we should be able to access those resources. And we all know we need trillions. And of course, nobody is saying that all the trillions that are required for this transformation need to be in the form of grants. And that's where investments come in, and soft loans and guarantees. So again, we need a global plan, and then we need to, downscale to have a regional plan and national plan. I think we are not having that conversation. So much of blame game, so much of finger pointing that we see in these climate talks, it's not taking us anywhere. And as Sharan very rightly mentioned, South Africa example, which is a glimmer of hope in these conversations. But then there are again big questions: who gets the money? Whether it's going to be same companies, or we are going to divert money for alternative livelihoods, or as what Jill says, promoting more equality and equity in the society, and reskilling and restructuring, creating models. So much needs to be done, and we really have to make sure that how we divert resources and where these resources are going to. And that's where I think the role of civil society becomes extremely important to play a role of a watchdog, not only of these international spaces, but at very local and national levels.
Right, and I'll bring Michal in at this stage, because if we're talking about, how you get resources from, say, the global level down to the person, on the ground who's dealing with the just transition, obviously social protection systems can play potentially a major role in this. And the World Bank has been working on this as part of its COVID-19 response as well. How do you think these social protection systems can be used to really sort of make a difference to people who are dealing with this at the rough end?
They are absolutely fundamental. Long before the COVID crisis, we called the fact that there is such a low coverage of social protection systems almost a disgrace. We call it a coverage gap. And it was a situation in which only 20% of the poorest 20% were covered by any type of a social safety net. Moreover, those social safety nets, when they existed, they focused on rural areas because this is where the poorest were, but not in urban informal sectors. The COVID crisis was a big call to action because those most affected were in urban informal sectors when there were no social safety nets. Now, I am extremely proud of our response and the World response on how we are able to scale up safety nets, including in the urban informal sector, including using innovative databases when social registries did not exist, and to respond to the needs of the crisis. But that should only highlight how critical it is to invest in social protection systems in between the crises, so that we have on the ground an adaptive system that could be scaled up and scaled down as needed. And this is critical. Moreover, it is very important that the access of, especially of informal sector workers, goes beyond social safety nets. They should also have an access to social insurance mechanisms to be able to deal with various lifetime risks. And that obviously requires supplemental public funding coupled together with mobilizing savings. It's a complicated endeavor. In fact, right after this session, that's why I need to finish sharply my time at 9:25, I chair launch of our new book on social insurance for the informal sector, which I am very proud of. But let me also tell you two other things. One is, this is why we are supporting in the World Bank the call to move to universal social protection. We emphasize we always need to start with the poorest and most vulnerable, but we would like to achieve a situation in which we are committed to a situation with other international partners that every person that needs social protection will have an access to appropriate social protection when they need it. Second point I want to mention, though, social protection understood that cash is not everything. And that's why we so much also support what we call economic inclusion programs, where those who are poor and vulnerable are able to link to value chains through cash, coupled with asset transfers, coaching, mentoring. And we also see that can bring opportunities to develop actually green economy, to move towards environmental services, to allow to engage mid to low skilled workers in better jobs than in alternative brown industries. And here we need to use social protection in terms of helping workers transit, but we need to go beyond that in order to make it meaningful. In that context, I think since we are talking about what's being done internationally, there are a few very interesting examples in the world. I think Rwanda's scheme, a range of programs supporting land restoration, ecotourism, climate, smart agriculture is a very good example. Morocco is pioneering green transition initiatives in a rural economy space, as well as export-oriented manufacturing sector. That's another good example. And then we have been supporting governments across sub-Saharan Africa through green public works programs that build resilience through temporary jobs for some of the poorest households. So we are abandoning the old approach in which public works is essentially an income support program. We believe that green public works is really an opportunity for the future. What workers do matters, and what they do can actually actually bring about a bigger transition. We call it nature-based public work schemes that have been effective, for instance, in reducing food insecurity and income vulnerability by providing economic opportunities and building resilience. So these are just a few examples, but I think one feature they all have in common is that they achieve the dual objective of, better jobs. They may not be yet fully decent jobs. We very often with Sharan discuss that, but better jobs, but also those that are good for environment. And these types of programs are really needed across the skills spectrum and across the productivity spectrum, not just in high-tech fields, so that workers in the lower end of the distribution can benefit from and contribute to the green transition.
Thanks, Michal. That's great to actually hear some of the examples of where these kind of public works schemes are being used in order to kind of help people skill up and also improve the natural environment as well. And I think India's tried a little bit of that as well. So we have about 25 minutes of discussion left, and actually we have quite a few questions coming in from our audience. So I think we'll shift straight to those questions. And I'll direct the question to one of you first, and then if you want to jump in, please feel free. But if you could just keep the answers relatively short, because as I say, we actually have a few questions, which is great. So the first question is actually about a group that we haven't really discussed so far, and it's investors. What should the role of investors be in a just transition? Should they be establishing and publicly communicating human rights standards for things like renewable energy investment? And should these be consistent with emerging official ESG standards? I'm wondering if perhaps Sharan, you'd like to take that one first, because clearly, I mean, there was a lot of talk at COP about investors and what they should be doing, but it's still pretty unclear, I think, in many cases.
So you've touched on a point of development that is indeed at the core of this. If you have, as you said earlier, Megan, just transition, human rights and environmental standards mandated, and the work going on in the EU with the social and environmental taxonomy, perhaps if they get it right, gives us a new floor for the way in which we organise our economy, the behaviour of business, international trade. But of course, it has to be global, so we have to find the global equivalents. Now, we say to the trade ministers who will meet shortly that, you need to think about what the fair competition floor is for a sustainable, respectful, rights-based future. And that means that you have to have, human and labour rights and environmental standards as a floor for behaviour of corporations. So it is about due diligence or analysing risk, but it's about indeed grievance and remedy, the compliance aspects as well. But what came to the fore during the COP was, of course, the announcement that the standards bodies, everything from disclosure to the actual reporting frameworks, would merge to some extent with the IFRS initiative. And they are highly ambitious to get out a climate standard by the end of next year. We made this, though, very clear that if it was just climate and it didn't have the social elements, the rights-based, the environmental standards that make it possible, that indeed are human-centred, then this would fail because, again, you would get that pushback or resistance. So it has to be done hand in hand. There is talk of parallel bodies, given that it's not possible potentially to do it all in one body, fine. But ultimately, it's not private standards that will make the difference. It is actually government saying we have an international body of law, particularly for human and labour rights. We have the reality of climate change and the commitments around everything from methane to nature-based solutions, ecosystem repair, and carbon reductions, of course. Then, let's get on with it. Let's actually get an understanding that our economies have to shift. We talk a lot about inclusive economies, but if they're going to be inclusive and environmentally stable so we can stabilise our home, the planet, then we need to act quickly on this. So I'm certainly supportive of any work going on, but I actually think governments can't step back on this one. It's like the subsidy question. And I will just back in my, Michal, we actually have a slight difference of opinion around the way in which you build social protection systems, but they should be universal. And it's a scandal that during COVID-19, let alone the climate disasters or the unemployment challenges for communities, 55% of the world's people have no social protection and 72 have little or none. So we've called for a social protection fund to be built in partnership with the World Bank, the other institutions, the ILO, of course, and the USP 30 group in the lead up to the UN Sustainable Development Goals deadline. We can help build those systems, and they're sustainable in both financial terms, but also they're a resilience base for communities overall, for workers and communities. And when you think about the intersection of decent work, minimum living wages, and social protection, what we have to work out together is not just the companies, and increasingly good companies are committed, thankfully, to minimum living wages, not enough of them yet, but across their supply chains. But what we need to work out is what's the equivalent for all those agricultural workers, for the self-employed women's workers, for the workers who are formally collecting waste. How do we intersect to get a minimum living income for those workers as well?
Right. Thanks, Sharan. Yeah, I mean, perhaps, Michal, you'd like to come back there and just respond to that. I'd ask you to keep your answers brief at the moment, please, because we've got a few more questions. And perhaps you could also address another question for us, Michal, which is, what's the role of the law here and having these mandatory human rights and environmental due diligence standards in order to improve rights and also social protection? And how do you basically push governments to bring those laws in quicker? Because as Jill said, it's crucial. If you could keep it brief, that would be fab. Thank you.
Absolutely. No, let me just fully endorse what Sharan says. We may have a luxury of saying that labor market is one thing and social protection is another
your own
thing.
and talk
when we talk about the upper
when I can.
echelon of the income ladder, but when it comes to economic inclusion and
well, since I get off
Sharan, sorry, would you mind muting?
What time have you got to leave?
Sharan, thank you. Go ahead, Michal. Sorry.
So I was just saying that we may have a luxury of separating labor market and income support, minimum living wage and income support when we talk about the upper part of the labor market. But when it comes to economic inclusion and livelihoods, those things need to be looked together. And I think on that we all agree. There is in the social protection world, I think the discussion is whether the global fund really will bring new resources. If it does, then I think it will be universal support around it. When it comes to more broadly resources going to other countries, I want to just bring to your attention that we will have our fund for the most needy countries, IDA, being replenished in December. And that's by far the best vehicle when we can devote, we hope that we will be close to 100 billion this time to the countries in need. And finally, I think our environmental and social framework recently approved with the support of all the stakeholders is really the best step towards supporting the standards you are asking for. And from our perspective, is a big step forward, which I think is recognized as such worldwide. Thank you.
Thank you, Michal. That's great. And I'd like to bring in Harjeet at this point to answer a question which may seem like it doesn't have a direct connection with just transition, but at COP26, one person is saying that we ended with no funding facilities to deal with the loss and damage that climate change is causing increasingly. And they want to hear your thoughts on that. And could you make the connection here with just transition and why that matters? Because surely if we're seeing communities hurt more and more by climate change, they're just not going to be able to manage a just transition, right?
Well, absolutely, Megan. When we talk about just transition, we are talking about both workers and communities at large. And when we talk about providing support to communities who are most vulnerable, they are not only vulnerable in terms of the transition that we are going for, but also climate impacts. And that's exactly the reason we were advocating for a loss and damage facility, which can have an oversight of whether enough support is going to communities who are facing this climate crisis. And I'll tell you why it is so important for just transition. If I put myself, and I keep saying that, if I put myself in the shoes of a finance minister and people are facing floods and storms and their houses are destroyed, you tell me, can I talk about solar panels, wind farms, and just transition? No, I have to fix the immediate crisis that I'm facing, right? So as finance minister, I'll allocate resources to first recover from these impacts. Then I'll invest resources to become resilient to future disasters. And then I'll talk about the transformation and the big thing that we are all working towards. So that's why global solidarity, to create that loss and damage fund or facility to help communities to deal with the climate crisis, so that we can actually collectively work towards just transition. And I must tell you, while we did not get the facility here, the kind of political momentum we have generated, in fact, I must say that the moment Alok Sharma gabbled down, both CMA and COP agreements, the first intervention came from Antigua and Barbuda, emphasizing that we did not get it, but we will not stop at a dialogue. We want it at the next COP. So I think we need that. I think we all need to understand you can't talk about future and leave communities who are facing impacts right now. So you have to first protect them, support them to recover, and also talk about future.
Right, absolutely, yes. We'll see what happens with the dialogue around financing for loss and damage, which the Glasgow Climate Pact has made a provision for between now and 2024. Jill, I have a question that I think would be one for you here. Somebody is asking, is the problem here not a lack of transparency in labour conditions in general? Perhaps that there are sort of hidden inequalities that are going on, and I don't know whether that's something that Laudes is working to try and sort of shine a light on some of these inequalities, and then we can start dealing with them within countries.
I think there's actually quite a lot of acknowledgement that labor rights are not secure in many countries. I actually wanted to address a question that you asked earlier, which is, how do we get these laws to be implemented more quickly?
Yeah.
And I think that's a big question, but my feeling is you really need the public will before you're going to get the political will. And that while public action is starting and there's more mobilization, it's still not strong enough, but people are going to have to demand change. And sometimes, there are surprising wins, like, who would have thought in the Netherlands earlier this year that the courts would rule against Shell? I mean, these things, sometimes you're surprised by things that people can do. But in general, I think before the courts and the governments take action, there's almost always going to be some shift in social legitimacy. So, if social movements can win the battle over public opinion, then the courts and the governments are going to fall in line. But the question is, we're not there yet. And I fear that we're not going to get there until people are personally affected by climate change, when there's a flood or a heat wave where they live. And, that's the biggest question is, speed. And when are we going to get to the tipping point? And do we all have to, have a collective heart attack before, that gets us to change?
I hope not. I do hope not, but that is a big question. We've only got we've got less than 5 minutes left, so I just wanted to ask each of you to give a very brief comment to finish us off, which can perhaps dovetail with another question that we have, which is, with just transition, how can the leaders of nations ensure that each and every community is receiving the same benefit, presuming that they can realise the benefits? And if not, what measures do you suggest should be put in place? I mean, that's a lot to answer in a minute each, but if you could just kind of pick out one thing that you think governments should be focusing on, leaders should be focusing on at this moment to ensure a just transition, that would be a great way of wrapping up this conversation, I think. So, Michal, we'll start with you.
Thank you very much. As we work in the World Bank with the governments, I think what I would highlight is the need for the governments to really play a critical role in the transition process. And it needs to be both proactive and multifaceted. And it's not that the government need to deliver everything themselves, but there is nobody else but the governments that need to provide strategic direction and leadership, coordinate among stakeholders, arbitrate competing interests, and mobilize adequate financing from within and international that represents really an investment in transition. It should be seen as an investment by the governments. That would be my one-liner or two-liner. Thank you.
Great, absolutely. So it should be seen as an investment, which I think is a positive take on this situation. Sharan, to you next. What's the most important sort of priorities right now that government should be focusing on?
Governments have a responsibility to their citizens for jobs, for rights and protections, and for indeed social protection. So if they're serious about democratic responsibility and building trust, what we saw in Copenhagen was, despite some of the people inside trying to do the right thing and oppose those who weren't, the chasm between that and the anger and distrust and fear outside, we need the tools to build that bridge, to regain hope and trust. And governments have to be able to convene companies, unions, communities, and put the money and the resources there to build their society. So going beyond GDP, taking responsibility, let's get a just transition that's built into a recovery from all the areas of crisis that have now intersected.
Thank you, Sharan. And Harjeet, perhaps you can address that question from India's perspective as well, because India has a big job to do, right, in terms of bringing about a just transition, because it is still building coal capacity, and yet at the same time it's also building renewables too. So how should India address this situation?
Well, India, as we all know, has multiple challenges, but somehow it has become a poster boy or poster girl of the whole discussion. So I think we need to really understand where India is coming from with the legacy of colonialism and with the kind of extractivism model that we got from British, and the Western economic model that has been forced upon us, which only looks at consumption without respecting planetary bodies. I think India needs to move away from that and should create its own model, because we have a large dependency. We're talking about 4 million workers. We're talking about 40% districts depending on coal directly, indirectly. But at the same time, there's a massive boost on renewables. So I think yet there are issues of storage technologies and others to be sorted, and global cooperation. So I think the important thing, and I would conclude by saying that we as a nation, also as a global community, need to put people at the heart of the just transition with inclusive planning and equitable resource allocation. And that should empower communities, because we can define a just transition now, but it's going to change. And if communities are not empowered and they cannot make those changes on their own, we can't take decisions on their behalf in the boardroom. So how do we empower communities in the process? I'm totally agreeing with Sharan. These have to promote, and as Jill said and Michal said, promote social protection and human rights. So I think those are central pillars of when we talk about just transition.
So we really need to be including the workers in these discussions at this point, and not assuming that they will just want to go along with solutions that governments come up with on their own. And that's a point that the ITUC and Sharan clearly has been making, that we need to have these dialogues at this stage, and those dialogues need to be convened earlier rather than later. Jill, I'm going to leave the final comment with you. And in fact, just to add, perhaps somebody raised a question about migrant workers and how you would, for example, bring migrant workers along in this transition. And that's something I think, in the garment sector, and the apparel sector is quite important because there are a lot of migrant workers, and I'm not just talking about across borders, but within countries as well.
So may I jump in? May I jump in very, very quickly, Megan? Which is to say that in all our interventions, we are insisting that migrant workers, both the domestic and international, are treated exactly the same way as domestic workers. That has been a very important aspect because of stranded migrants. Let me also announce something which is perhaps not announced yet, but our next World Development Report 2023 of the World Bank will be on migration and refugees. And this will be a first time in the history of the World Bank where the World Development Report will focus on migration. So for us, it's a historic moment. Thank you.
Oh, that's extremely interesting to know. Thank you for that, Michal. I look forward to seeing that report indeed. Jill, over to you. Thank you.
Well, just really quickly, I mean, we're starting to see, and we have seen already, a lot of climate-induced migration, and there's going to be more and more of that. And I would just echo what Harjeet said, you know, you got to put the people at the heart, at the center. I think governments have to ensure that they have more diverse voices in those decision-making halls, and the people are going to need to demand to be in those halls and to be heard as well.
Absolutely. Well, I think that rounds off the conversation nicely. I mean, what's coming out of it for me is that this has to be a whole of society, whole of economy effort, and that we all need to pitch in. And it's not just governments, it's governments, it's companies, it's people, it's workers and their families and their communities. And in order to ensure that we see more benefits than disadvantages, and that we avoid huge amounts of social disruption as we sort of race towards the green transition that we know we have to do. It's a question of bringing everybody along and making sure, as the SDGs have as their central tenet, that nobody is left behind. And that will be a difficult job and a huge challenge, like you've all outlined today. And I hope that this panel is a useful contribution to that discussion. So I would just like to finish by saying thank you so much to our speakers who have brought really diverse and broad perspectives to this conversation. And I guess this is where the real work starts. So good luck with all of your endeavours, and thank you very much indeed. And thanks to the audience for the questions and listening. Thanks so much. Bye, everybody.